conversation this evening is about the book written by the late Paul Moore. The book is entitled Crash Bank Wallop, and it's an excellent first-hand account of his experiences as a whistleblower. We, the task force, believe that whistleblowing is a very, very, very important part of the financial ecosystem. We think that people should feel safe and confident to blow the whistle. We think that whistleblowers should be protected from the organisation that they are working for when they blow the whistle. And it goes without saying that they should also be protected by the regulatory framework as well. And as you'll be hearing from this evening's session, we think that that has not always been the case. As Robert has just put into the chat, please do mute yourself before speaking. That way we can minimize the background noise. There are one or two sort of new members of TTF, as it were, to the session. So I'm going to spend about 1 minute explaining who we are and what we do. The Transparency Task Force is a very fast-growing international community of people that care. We care about the financial services sector behaving properly. We want the sector to behave in a trustworthy, transparent, and truthful way. We think that it has, in so many ways, lost sight of its true purpose, which is to serve society, and it has become driven by the idea of maximizing profit in the short term. We think that there are many, many, many people that suffer directly and indirectly as a consequence of that. So if you're new to TTF, if this is the first ever event that you've been to, then please do pop me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat, and pop me an email to make sure we can add you to our circulation list. It's free to be added to the circulation list, and we do publish a weekly newsletter called the Transparency Times, which you can get, and through that you'll know about various other activities that we are up to. I'm briefly going to mention two other very, very important points. One is an idea that our speaker, Robert Delner, will elaborate on, to do with a trophy. That's a very, very important part of tonight's proceedings. And the second is the idea of a research exercise, a survey exercise that we are planning to conduct in relation to the experiences that people have had when they have blown the whistle, particularly in relation to their interaction with regulators. The session is formally due to finish at 7 p.m. UK time. I'm happy if others want to carry on chatting after that to continue for a while afterwards. This is our very first ever book review session. We'll have these quite frequently, typically once every month or so. So just to repeat the key points, we're recording this, so don't say anything you don't want to go out there. If you happen to make a mistake and say something you wish you hadn't, that's okay, but be sure to send my colleague Alexandra Zitkus an email. I'll also put Alexandra's email into the chat very, very shortly. Second key point is please keep yourselves on mute unless you're speaking. Third key point is we are keen to get this research exercise up and running. But without any further delay, I'll be passing to Robert Delner very, very shortly. Please all do exactly as Steve Hubbard has kindly done, which is to put his notes about himself into the chat. That way we don't have to spend time doing it and we can handle it very, very efficiently. And the final thing we're going to do before we go to Robert Delner is ask Anthony Stansfield, only going to be with us for literally a few minutes, to briefly introduce himself and perhaps just spend a sentence or two explaining his perception on the importance of a good, fair, safe whistleblowing system. Anthony, to you first. Thank you.
Right. Well, I first came across the problem over the business of the something called the Turnbull Report, written by Sally Masterton, which was an expose by a senior employee of Lloyd's of what had gone on within the HBOS business and the takeover of HBOS by Lloyd's. It was a devastating article. It showed that basically that the audits have been fiddled, I think is the best way to put it, and rights issues of about 13 million had been done on totally fraudulent documentation. And she also pointed out a number of other things that had gone hugely wrong within Lloyd's and within HBOS. In spite of the fact she was commissioned and discussed it, and I have the emails, with the head of audit and risk of Lloyd's, she was sacked really without any proper compensation. And Lloyd said her report was not authorised. Well, it certainly was authorised, was not substantiated. Well, it was certainly substantiated. And also, she'd rather lost the plot, which she certainly hadn't. She was a very bright lady. Anyway, it took 3 years, really, pushing from me and from Lord Hollick to eventually pin Lloyd's to the wall on it, and they eventually paid her. Paid her off and had to admit that a great deal of what she'd said was substantiated. In fact, everything she said was substantiated, though Lloyd's wouldn't admit to it. But what became apparent also was when Lloyd's were forced, very reluctantly, I may say, into paying compensation for the victims of the HBOS frauds out of Reading, which probably came to about 850 million. We only prosecuted on 245 million. Lloyd's has been boasts that it's paid out 100 million in compensation, which is only probably a third of what it should have paid out. But what I find extraordinary about that is every one of the victims has had to sign an NDA. A lot of the victims are quite old now, and basically they're being told, please don't, we'll threaten you. If you whistleblow on this, and by putting an NDA out in them. And I think that is actually totally immoral. However good your case is, if the bank doesn't want to pay you and you've had all your money taken off you, you're in no position to fight a major bank. And when they pay you off sometimes a derisory sum compared to what should have been paid, you're then stuck with an NDA, but you have no alternative other, really, if you want any money back, you may well have lost your house and everything, other than to sign the NDA, and that stops whistleblowers completely. And the FCA, especially over Sally Marston, knew perfectly well about this for 3 years, 4 years, I think, and failed utterly to protect her. I think it is utterly scandalous, that. And it's interesting, the chairman of the FCA at the time, his previous job was senior partner of KPMG, whose audit of HBOS was one of the major problems that lay behind all of this. And I think I probably said enough, but I said I am the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, and we have, I've followed this up to the best of my ability now for the last 4 years or so. It's unfortunate I actually stepped down sometime this year whenever we have the next set of PCC elections, which is scheduled for May. But this needs sorting out. I actually have a meeting at the very top end of Lloyd's with their most senior people next week. And I think Lloyd's have eventually woken up to just how serious this has actually become for them. And I hope for once they don't listen to their legal team in Herbert Smith Freehills, who have cost them hundreds of millions already, and start actually sorting the problem out. And I think we are getting closer than we've ever been before to that actually happening. And it's worth pointing out the entire executive board of Lloyd's, and I think I'm right in saying it's all of them, but certainly most of them and the chairman are all leaving over the course of 3 or 4 months as the new chairman, new chief executive. So I hope they come in and try to start cleaning up the mess in Lloyd's. And it's not just in Lloyd's, of course, it's also in Westminster, RBS and Clydesdale, other banks that primarily come up. Other banks come up in a few cases, but I don't think it was systemic, which it clearly was in those 3 banks. Anyway, I've said enough now. Thanks, Andy.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. And Anthony used the phrase, he's done as much as he could do over the last few years, and he really has been battling a hell of a lot over the last few years to try to get serious, proper reform at the very top end of the banks. And Anthony, as you know, we truly salute you and the work that you've been doing, and we're ever so grateful that we happen to have right now a police crime commissioner with such a strong sense of ethics and virtues that really wants the right thing to be done. We're going to be passing over to our first speaker, Robert Delner. Robert Delner is an ambassador of the Transparency Task Force. He's been a wonderful ally over several years. Robert is somebody I often draw upon to get insights and thoughts and ideas. He has a wonderfully comprehensive understanding of so many of the interconnected issues which riddle the financial services sector with problems, but he's also an inherent optimist and is very enlightened in his view. I think you're going to enjoy listening to Robert speak, and for reasons that will become very, very apparent very, very quickly, Robert really is extremely well qualified to speak about Paul Moore's book, and I would even go further to kind of speak on behalf of Paul Moore rest in peace. Robert, I invite you please to take position. I know you have a slide deck. Feel free to start sharing that now. You should be able to do that straight away. And I'm going to pass over to yourself. And if anybody has anything they want to ask or a comment they want to make during the presentation, please drop a question into the chat. We can always refer to that. And we'll also be having a discussion afterwards. I do hope that's all very clear. And if you haven't yet put a note in the chat about yourself, introducing yourself to everybody else here, please do so. Okay, so Robert Delmer, over to you, please. Thank you very much indeed for doing this for us. Thank you very much. And for Paul.
Thank you, Andy. Much appreciated. And thank you, Anthony, also sincerely for the introduction to this meeting. I think what you said has certainly a lot of parallels with what Paul went through, unfortunately, in his role at HBOS and also his life after HBOS, which we'll get into shortly. But let me just take you back a little bit in time, just to put this into context, because I met Paul around 2009, 2010. At the time, I was sitting on the executive committee of what was then Fortis Bank, became BNP Paribas Fortis Bank, as a global head of a division there. And having left the bank in 2010, it became very obvious to me, as it had been for many years before, that there was something fundamentally wrong within the culture of banking and the financial industry. And I reached out to a host of people at the time to seek to create an ecosystem of people who were working on sort of some kind of reform agenda. And Paul was one of those individuals who I reached out to, and we very quickly connected on a number of different levels. We then collaborated and worked together for a few years on the reform agenda. And then in 2015, I think it was, he then became chairman of Assets Capital in the UK. And we then worked together. He then brought me in to become the CCO of that particular firm. He then left because of differences in strategic intent and execution with the firm. And Paul and I has remained friends and close over many years, up until his death late last year. So it gives me great privilege, of course, to deliver this book review. So thank you, Andy. I will now move to screen share, if that's okay with everyone. And just initially talk a little bit about the book, and the book in context of where we are today, and also share with you a video shortly, which was part of a news review, including Paul. So Paul Moore said very famously, and he's put that in his book, that you can't defeat Goliath with your mouth shut. And that is something he picked up on a car journey when he was listening to Joyce Meyer. Then this was one of his pivotal points in his life, when he had significant doubts what to do and how to move forward following his departure from HBOS. And as Anthony earlier said, very often, and in his case, it was clearly the situation where he was also, had written a non-disclosure agreement with the bank that he then finally had to overcome. So to not do what you can to protect someone, that's cowardly. That's Anderson's quote, which is also in the TTF book, and kind of sets the tone for who I think Paul was as a person, and what he ended up doing. I think he said to me once that had I known where it was going to end up, and the cost to his life and his family's life, he's not sure he would have done it. But fundamentally, he said, I wouldn't have changed a thing. Without much further ado, I'm going to show you a clip from a news, and I'm going to hope that this now shares the screen. Can everyone see the RT screen, or can they just see the?
No, we can only see the book at the moment, still on your slide deck.
Okay, so let me do this. I will stop share and I will go back into share screen.
Very good. And while you're doing that, I just want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. We've got a great turnout, especially as it's our first ever book review session. And I think everyone's in for a bit of a treat in terms of insight and understanding of Paul's book. Robert, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to show you this. It's 10 minutes, but it will give you a very good idea of Paul as a, you know, the measure of the man and what he stands for, and how energetically he actually puts forward his case. So this is an RT interview.
Some saw Wall Street and the City of London for what they were long before the 15th of September 2008, though. And it wasn't just socialist politicians like Jeremy Corbyn who saw it coming. Those who worked in the banks themselves saw it coming. And when they told their superiors, they were sacked. Joining me now is Paul Moore, author of Crash Bang Wallop and the former head of regulatory risk at one of the biggest banks in the world, HBOS. Paul, thanks for coming back on. There'll be acres of newsprint, loads of stories about the 10-year anniversary. Some people saying this isn't an accounting story, a political story, it's a criminal story.
It's a tale full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. The reality is that although some changes have taken place in the banking world, and we can talk about those in a minute if you like, the reality was that it was the biggest opportunity that this world had seen for a century to regain some kind of control of the wayward capitalistic system that we've got, rein it in somewhat, and gain control of the corporatocracy, because we don't really live in democracies. We live in a corporatocracy where the big companies control the democratic processes. Look, you can go through every single protagonist, I'm happy to do so, but they're exactly the same people. You've got exactly the same executives. The academic evidence proves conclusively that they have very high levels of psychopathic attribute. It's very important that you have the same type of executives, you're going to get the same situation occurring again. You've got the same chief financial officers who do what they're told by the chief executive and keep the auditors under control. You've got control functions, risk, compliance, internal audit, that are not protected. Whistleblowers are still not properly protected, even though people say they are. You've got non-executive directors, members of the same cozy club as the executives themselves, who don't control the executives whatsoever. Shareholders don't exercise any stewardship. Auditing, do you want to talk about auditing and accounting? We can get onto that. That is the biggest disgrace in the whole thing. Regulators, well, you appoint exactly the same people. So you take the chairman of KPMG, Sir John Griffiths Jones, and appoint him as the chairman of the Financial Conduct Authority.
Well,
what are you going to
get? I want to get onto that. And I have to say the big four all say they operate in the strictest of standards. Before we get on a bit more into those issues, you mentioned psychopathy, which is a criminal term often used in court. British Medical Journal says that austerity that ensued after the crash of your bank, of Lehman Brothers, maybe by 2020 will have killed 200,000 people. We're talking about mass murder.
That's a gross underestimate. In the year or so after the banking crisis, the United Nations itself published a figure that proved that over 100 million people around the world have been driven back into abject poverty by the banking crisis. Now, the mortality statistics, that means the number of extra people who die as a result of poverty, are somewhere around the 15% mark. That means that the banking crisis killed more people, about 15 million, the exact number is not quite clear, about 15 million people, which is more than any conflict since the Second World War. So the banking crisis wasn't just about money, it was about death. And of course, it made everybody's lives a misery, and still does.
The response to it. Now I want you to remind us what you said to the UK Parliament's Treasury Select Committee that secured the resignation of Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown's advisor, who was the Deputy Chairman of the Financial Services Authority, James Crosby.
I told them that I knew exactly, because I was so senior, I was one down below main board level, I was the head of risk at HBOS, and I knew what had caused the crisis, which was a completely inadequate separation and balance of power between the executive on the one hand and everybody else who's supposed to be keeping them under control, all those figures that I've described. And I said that it doesn't matter what the structures look like. You can have the best governance structures and processes in the world, but if they're carried out in a culture of greed, unethical behavior, and indisposition to challenge, they will fail.
Because KPMG, one of the big auditors,
Yeah.
we should add, the other ones, PwC, Ernst & Young, Deloitte,
Yeah.
in the news, some would say here because of Russian money slushing around this country.
Maybe.
They're doing quite a lot out of that. Basically, KPMG contradicted your assessments of existential risk at HBOS.
Yes, I mean, it was a cover-up. And I'm very happy and have been demanding a proper investigation into my allegation that they covered it up ever since I went public in 2009. The Financial Reporting Council that regulates accountants does nothing. Carillion, you can think of dozens of
The
examples.
big outsourced contractor
Auditing
paid by the taxpayer.
Auditing is a crucially important part of the separation and balance of power. It is not being done properly, and the auditing prior to the banking crisis of the big banks was a fundamental root cause of the failures in the first place. They knew. I know because I was a partner at KPMG, and I know how good the people at KPMG are in terms of their intellect and cognitive ability and finding things
If
out.
you don't get the information from the company, what can you do?
They do get the information from the company. They can go anywhere, see anything, talk to anybody. Everybody talks to the auditors. Nobody was covering things up for them. I told the auditors. They sit in the group audit committee meetings. They sit in the risk control committee meetings. They hear what is being said.
And if management say, okay, we'll get another auditor and we'll sack you as the auditors because of the way you're probing our accounts.
I'm not saying that there aren't changes that need to be made to make auditing better protected so that you can't fire an auditor when they speak up. That needs to be done. And there is a review taking place of the regulation of accounting and auditing and corporate governance by Sir John Kingman. And in fact, I'm going to go and see them. But let me just tell you one incredible story. I spoke up in the group audit committee before I went to the board at HBOS, basically telling them if they carried on this way, they were going to blow the bank up. Didn't use those words, obviously. And the next day, the audit partner from KPMG said he thought I had a death wish. What does that tell you about his state of mind? Anybody who speaks up has a death wish. So that's their frame of mind. And if an auditor can't speak up, then we're in trouble, and we still are in trouble. We haven't done what we needed to do.
So what did you feel like when you heard about the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy 10 years today? Did you see it as, and it was just a few days before then your bank went bust and had to be paid off by the taxpayer. Did you think, oh, maybe there'll be a chance now for a realignment here of capitalism?
I am not a radical socialist. I mean, absolutely, I am a capitalist, but we need a different form of kind of community collaborative capitalism. We need to rein in the excesses of it. Adam Smith did not describe free market economics in the way that it is currently described. He believed that conscience would control things, because in those days there was a regulator called the Divine Judgment Authority, which controlled people. So
No revolving door then.
no, I think that's a permanent position now.
Well, even the former Financial Conduct Authority executive, Clive Adams, said the people most culpable were let off. What's your reaction to the fact that no one's been really sent to jail?
It's just, it's no wonder ordinary people. I spoke to my wife coming down in the car yesterday from Yorkshire, and she said, well, I don't see anything change because nobody was ever held to account. But I want to just go back to the previous question, it's very important. The only reason I spoke up and breached my gagging order and went and blew the whistle publicly was because I felt that I was in a unique position of being so senior that I knew exactly what had happened and what could be done to prevent it happening again. And what is so sad to me is that we didn't use this as the opportunity to make the changes that needed to be made. Yes, of course, I'm in favor of control-free market economics. That is the best way to bring people out of poverty, but not the way it's currently done. When fiduciary duties were invented for limited liability companies, nobody dreamt that a company would have a balance sheet the size of a sovereign government and more power than a sovereign government. So banks are one thing, and they're the tip of the thing. But really, we should have used the opportunity to make some very serious changes to all of these structures that I'm talking about, and in particular, remove the protagonists who have high levels of psychopathic attribute from the boardrooms.
Well, what if someone gets the impression from watching this that you're emblematic of the fact that things do work then, because you did come forward, you did have a gagging order, and you did reveal what you knew?
Yes, but it didn't do any good, did it? It didn't hold people to account. It didn't get me.
You're okay as a human being.
Well, I had, to be honest, I had through that period I had some serious mental health issues which were caused by the trauma and the incredible disappointment. The excitement of speaking up and feeling that everybody agreed, which they did, and then nothing happening. Because the entire response to the banking crisis was effectively controlled. So it was a disappointment to me. I'm afraid it is a very risky business, speaking truth to power. And it's not just the fact that obviously you irritate the person who fired you and the people at the top, but it's when your friends scatter like the four winds because of the potential infection, because you almost become part of a leper colony. I never got another job after this. And I am a very competent individual who knows what they're talking about. I spent more time helping organizations to take more risk than the other way around, because great risk management is like Formula One racing. It's not about slowing people down. It's about making sure that the driver knows that they how not to drive into the Armco and, you know, when the brakes are going and that sort of thing.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
So thank you for listening to that. I think, you know, hopefully you get the measure of
the whole sort of system that was
apologies
inside banks, the way they were.
This is the next YouTube. So let me share with you screen again. I hope you got the measure of the man, and it's an overview, of course, at the time where Paul was, and subsequent to this, of course, he did then write the book, came out in 2015-16, called Crash Bank Wallop. So let's go into more detail with regards to the book itself, and just sort of talk through what are the sort of key areas within the book and the key lessons learned, and have a discussion afterwards. So I'm going to share with you this screen now. So hopefully, again, you can see the book screen itself.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So we'll come back to him as an individual and his personal journey that he outlines in the book. So you got a strong sense, I'm sure, from that interview as well, that Paul was a man of faith. He had a lot of trust in that, you know, his God was guiding him in his actions and in his behavior. And this was one of the key elements which you see in the book that took him over that line where he was gagged and into becoming the whistleblower. I think you'll see, and you would read, that Paul had a tremendous amount of courage and integrity for what he did, and a capacity to speak truth to power. That, given his background, he was a barrister by trade, so legally trained. He had a diligent and forensic attention to detail, and you'll see in this book evidence of that throughout, that everything he ever did was corroborated, and he kept detailed accounts of all conversations and all emails, etc., that is referred to in the book. He's also positive, optimistic, and hopeful with regards to the future itself, even though he, as you heard there, said very clearly that he thinks that this was an opportunity missed. And also in later discussions I had with him, he often also said that, you know, he felt it's a shame that not more had actually happened, not more change has actually happened within some of these institutions, particularly the FSA, FCA now, which we'll come to, I'm sure, later on. I also think that you'll find that Paul was very authentic to life and life's journey, the ups and downs of life and how to manage that. But he fought his demons and also fought to overcome them. So you'll see that in the books, he's very open about his issues around his mental health and also around his addiction to alcohol. So I'm just putting out a couple of quotes here. He's mentioned forgiveness races towards repentance at God's speed. And as Maureen Oates said to him, "Oh, don't worry, Paul, it's all parts of God's plan for you." So, you know, he also said, "I never wanted to sign the HBOS gagging order. And from the outset, I was only after truth, justice, and reform." And this is kind of his sort of what I'm trying to do is just distill his kind of personal journey throughout this particular period, but also what is sort of highlighted, I believe, in the book. And he said towards the end that truth will set you free, of course, but the truth is not always itself free. I know that. I think that was kind of one of his disappointments later on, that not more had actually been taking place as a result. He also said that the allegations he made to the original testimony had been both denied by Lord Stevenson, Andy Hornby and Crosby, and the FSA. And all parties had been relying on this report, which he writes a lot about, produced by KPMG to deny the truth, which had said in his original testimony. And he said then that I read with interest that Sir James continues to refute the allegations I made in my evidence to the Treasury Select Committee. And I want all those interested to know that I continue to stand firm and confidently behind what I have said. I have a significant body of detailed additional evidence which will corroborate what I've said. I'm confident that the independent report, this is the KPMG report to which James has referred, will not bear up to any proper independent scrutiny. This was in February 2009. And this is from a publication Parliament report that you can see the link to there. So with regards to HBOS itself, as you probably heard him say, it was a growth strategy, and you could call it a growth strategy at all costs, very much focused on sales. There's no coincidence that there are maybe some parallels between what happened here and also what happened more lately at banks such as Wells Fargo, who set very high expectations, bonuses, standards according to sales growth only. There was also a culture of indifference towards its various stakeholders. And you could call it an inept and self-serving management, and a cultural indisposition to challenge. So when Paul, as he points out in the book, went out and started to talk to various stakeholders internally within the organization, he was basically rebuked and rebuffed. There was also significant amount of groupthink and compliant behavior. So this is the collective self-serving that comes into play at board level when someone comes in, such as Paul, and basically challenges the board in and around strategic intentions and behaviors. So in retrospect, of course, you could see that this was a series of misdirected policies and procedure, which then had to be played out, but also a real lack of transparency and accountability for the board itself, and in alignment with a culture of denial and obfuscation. So what Paul then said was that they're all individually good people, but when they're out for their own goals, well, that's in his introduction. And your group risk manager said that you were selling too fast, too much, and it was very risky, so you sacked him. It was George Mundy, NP, and that's on page 419. So again, with regards to HBOS itself, it was kind of an accident waiting to happen, which Paul sought to challenge. So what can we draw from this from a sort of national or a sectoral or industry point perspective? Well, what KPMG did in relation to your investigation was completely wrong. That was a statement that he received. That's on page 311 in the book. There was a lack of accountability, justice, retribution, and reconciliation, as we know now. When Paul spoke in that interview, he felt that very clearly. And there is a culture in finance which remains largely unchanged, particularly in key areas around risk and growth and business opportunity, etc. The regulatory capture, and you can argue in the industry, co-opting the regulator itself, has now made the regulator potentially unfit for purpose. And you've seen over the last few weeks, really a little bit more narrative around that particular point. So is the FCA, and some of you will be very familiar with the language here, is the FCA itself a fit and proper institution who is exhibiting honestly integrity and reputation, competence and capability? That is a question to consider. So one thought is if to turn around their own rule book basically on themselves, do they stand up to scrutiny in that respect? So in the book, he says that the FCA would know that KPMG had failed to follow proper protocol, but the FCA never did contact me. And it now turned out that the HBOS rights issue was also based on what appears to be deliberate misrepresentation to the market, which could well amount to various criminal offenses. So that's another strand of activity, which again, as a culture, as part of HBOS, has sort of highlighted how the board operated at the time. So Kenneth Clark said, Paul, your evidence demonstrate at least civil wrongdoing and possible criminal wrongdoing. And we'll come back to that very shortly, because now as we sort of start discussing what this book actually means for us and what it could mean for its implications for the industry. So what are the lessons learned, and what, if any, actions have been taken so far, and what more can we do at the TTF and as an industry to kind of activate and accelerate some of these points? And Paul then said that, yes, it is true, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the other statement here, linking back to Kenneth Clark, in Paul's book, he says, suddenly it seemed the Justice Secretary, Ken Clark, was on the warpath. This was after he had then become the Justice Secretary himself. In June 2012, he insisted bankers who had committed crime must be prosecuted. And what did Clark and the government do this time? No. That's kind of how the book virtually finishes. But afterwards, he said, it's funny how everyone considers honesty a virtue, yet no one wants to hear the truth. And this is kind of the dilemma I think all whistleblowers will face once they blow the whistle. And this leads for a discussion around the book and Paul's life, and what basically the industry and the TTF can take from the lessons learned here. But also to maybe initiate what we and Andy referred to earlier as a potential in memoriam to Paul, this idea of having an annual whistleblower award to someone who is has taken that courage as well and helped the industry to understand better how the industry itself operates. So on the whistle that you may have read, Paul received anonymously, there was an inscription, Dulce decorum est pro patria testari, which is, it is sweet and honorable to speak up for your country. And he cherished that very much, and I think it's part of his legacy and in memoriam if the TTF would continue to award someone with that. Thank you. I think that leads to the end of this particular presentation. So I'll leave it now to Andy to kind of facilitate a discussion and thoughts and considerations around the book and Paul and what his legacy is actually leaving behind for all of us. So thank you, Andy, for allowing me to make this presentation.
Robert, on the contrary, thank you very much indeed for inspiring this event, helping to inspire our book club idea, inspiring us with the idea of the trophy, the Paul Moore Trophy, and delivering such a well thought through, balanced, thought-provoking session. Can we, before we do anything else, folks, can we please show our appreciation to Robert for sharing that insight and that wisdom with us? Can we please do that? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Excellent, excellent. Now we have quite a few folks on the session tonight, and I would encourage that we make sure we give anybody on the session who themselves personally has been involved with any kind of whistleblowing activity ample opportunity to share their thoughts. I know we have a few on the call tonight that have gone through a painful process. And of course, only share as much as you wish to share. But could I first of all invite anybody that's been a whistleblower themselves to reflect on what Robert has been saying and to reflect on on Paul Moore's experience, and also, of course, to very, very succinctly let us understand a little bit about the experiences that you've been through as well. Would anybody like to kick us off from that, who's actually been through some kind of whistleblowing themselves in a personal capacity? Liz, thank you. Please do unmute yourself, Liz. Lovely to have you with us, Liz. Thank you. Please do, as succinctly as you can, because we've got quite a few people to get through. Please do share with us your thoughts, Liz. Thank you.
Yes, I spoke to Paul Moore a few times. I knew him through Ian Fraser, who wrote Shredded about RBS, but was very au fait with the frauds of HBOS particularly around the millennium, leading to the crash. I mean, it started a good 8 years earlier. And Paul had done that excellent whistleblower letter, which was a statement to Parliament, which I can copy and paste in the chat if you like.
Yes, please.
The link to it, because it's actually very interesting to the Treasury Select Committee. But one thing that really sticks out in my memory is when Paul was on national television. I think it was BBC, and he was actually very animated and obviously very angry about the fact that he made a statement: hundreds of billions of pounds have been squirreled out of the economy offshore. And it's funny, I've been looking for that footage from BBC. I'm thinking of writing to them to get it again, because I think this needs to be put under the nose of the Treasury. They need to have a good long look at that, because hundreds of billions of pounds, you know, the COVID thing, the government spent, I think, 5 billion on 3.5 million vaccines. If you think about it, hundreds of billions out the economy, where did the money go? And Paul was right. He was fighting a battle. You know, read the whistleblower letter because it's very interesting. But I remember saying, what's your advice? I told him about the Vavasur fraud. Literally, they've made trillions of the pounds of the 233 million that was disappeared in 2001 by the HBOS private banking unit. But interestingly, not many people realize this perhaps, but HBOS wasn't actually a bank at the millennium, or in 2001, 2, 3. It wasn't a bank, a registered bank, a licensed bank until 2007, 17th September 2007. One of the banking experts I think is a member of TTF, has said actually it was a holding company. HBOS PLC was a holding company. So all of the, you know, shall we say, illegal transactions that were done pre the crash were kind of housed and swallowed up by the HBOS 2006 Reorganisation Act in Parliament. And I think that's something TTF could look at more closely, because the impact of that act was deleterious to the people that lost money from all the fake accounts that were set up in the preceding years leading to the crash. That's how the bubble resulted, because there was an imbalance and it was so big, it just went bang. And I remember talking to Paul about this, and I said, what's your advice? And he said one word. He said, pray.
Oh, well, Liz, thank you very much indeed for making that point so well. Thank you. Would anybody else like to make a point at this stage, whether you've been a whistleblower or not? Anything that you'd like to share, please just wave your hand. I can see that William's doing so. William, please take yourself off mute, which is at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. There we go. And William, please introduce yourself and tell us what you'd like to say. Thank you.
Hi, I'm William May. I've been writing some reports in the wake of the Lloyds Bank scandals. I just wanted to make two points about Paul Moore. First of all, what a brave chap he was, and the key point, I think, is that he was on his own. Now there's a much greater body of victims who are all speaking out, but at the time when Paul Moore spoke out, he was entirely on his own. He bravely spoke up in front of the Treasury Select Committee in February 2009, but by and large got nowhere. It's fascinating that the cover-up is still continuing there. So first point is that he was entirely on his own. The second point relates to what Anthony mentioned about the HBOS Reading and Sally Masterton. It's fascinating, I think, to read Paul Moore's book and to understand that he, throughout that book, there is no mention whatever of the HBOS Reading fraud, which was clearly bubbling along. HBOS Reading, I think, was Gordon Brown was alerted to that in October 2008. So it was very much going along at the same time as Paul Moore, but it's fascinating that Paul Moore had absolutely no knowledge of that scandal whatever. Anyway, those are my 2 points.
Thank you very much indeed, William. Thank you. Now, somebody in the chat has made a very interesting point about the trophy idea. Joanne comments that I think the whistleblower trophy idea is superb. It would be helpful to also move the social dial of being a snitch when actually doing a public service to highlight serious harm to consumers and the public. I want to pick up on that point, and perhaps Joanne would like to elaborate on it in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to refer to some personal experience I had. I worked for a great big organization, Prudential Private Financial Planning Services. At the time, I was an executive sales manager, and there was a practice going on within Prudential Private Financial Planning Services to basically massage the sales figures. If a client was investing a capital sum, the sales consultants were trained, stress this, trained, to not only invest the capital sum, but also to sell a regular premium investment contract that was funded by withdrawals from the capital sum. Net result, probably, most likely disadvantageous to the client for all sorts of reasons, but a significant improvement, inverted commas, in the sales figures. That happened throughout this organization. Myself and some friends kicked up about it. We said, this isn't right, it shouldn't be happening. I reported it, and I'm happy to go on record here. I reported it to the head of compliance of the organization at the time. I remember saying, please don't drop me in it, will you? But I need to tell you something. Went off and told him what I said. Next day, I was confronted by my very, very, very angry sales manager. And unsurprisingly, I ended up out of a job shortly after. I know the turmoil, the emotional turmoil that goes on in your mind when you're not sure whether you should or shouldn't say something. And I know that organizations can make you feel guilty and bad. You're somehow jeopardizing the sales success of the organization by speaking out. There's all sorts of psychological games that go on that really do discourage people from speaking out. And I love the point that Robert drew attention to in his presentation, an indisposition to challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, any organization, any society, any country that has an indisposition to challenge is baking into itself massive problems for later. We want people who blow the whistle, who do it obviously in a courteous and civilized and appropriate way. We want them not to feel bad about themselves, because so often that's exactly how they're made to feel. They're made to feel bad, and it's very clear and very obvious that that's exactly what Mr. Paul Moore went through. Joanne, I'd like you, if you don't mind, to elaborate on why you feel it's a good idea to try to do something so that whistleblowers do not be made to feel like snitches. And of course, Joanne, share with us anything else that you might like to. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'd like to thank Robert for the presentation as well. I never met Paul Moore or had the chance to speak to him. I wish I had, because I think his book is amazing. It breaks my heart that he tries so hard to get people to believe him when he's so genuine, and you can hear it so clearly. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. And I just want to say that it should never be about the whistleblower or what their character is. It should just be about what they've reported. If I reported there was a dead body in the archive foyers of the bank, the police wouldn't want to know all about me and investigate me. They'd want to go and find the body.
Bravo.
And it's just so heart-wrenching when I read his book and I hear how he tries so hard to put himself forward as a credible, honest, sincere person with loads of problems. Those problems were his personal problems. They should never have come into the equation. It should always have been about what he was reporting. I see so many parallels between him and my own case. Right from KPMG to consumer credit fraud, to reporting, I went all the way to the chairman, to the CEO, Jess Staley, who at the time was being investigated for hunting down another whistleblower. I suffered completely at the hands of the bank, was completely bullied to the point that I resigned because I could take it no longer. I reported to the FCA just to have the same victimization go on again. And I'm sorry I'm so emotional, but I just find I cannot believe that he reported in 2004 he wrote the book in 2015. I was reporting from 2015 to the bank. I resigned in 2017. I reported to the FCA. And I'm talking about millions of pounds of fraud that has gone on against consumers. And the FCA has done nothing but run circles around me. They've strung me along. They've said things like, oh, your information was so valuable. It's fed into many different streams. You know, we applaud you. And then eventually I realized, no, you're stringing me along because nothing has come out in the media in terms of sanctions. Yes, there's been some remediations. There's been quite a few millions worth of remediations, but no sanctions, no truth as to what happened, but rather the bank just saying, oh, they found these mistakes. It's not true. None of that is true. And I cannot believe that we sit here in this world today knowing what's going on and we can't stop it. Now, Paul was a high flyer and he was a well-qualified professional man, a top-performing KPMG partner. He worked as a general counsel, he had 12 years barrister experience. I was frontline. I was the Scunthorpe lady that he talks about in his book, who was frontline, knew exactly what was going on. And if he can't be heard, and if his investigation, if a serious investigation can't be done into what he reported, how on earth can I be heard? And it's just this idea of how do we allow this to go on? How does this go on 2 decades later?
Joanne, thank you for your courage in speaking out, not just now, but also in what you've been doing over the years. I'm in admiration of you, Joanne. And if people don't know Joanne's story but want to, then reach out to her, because we can learn so much from Joanne as we can learn from Paul Moore. Thank goodness Paul left his book for us. It's like a roadmap of what we need to fix. It's so clear. It's so bleeding obvious. So much so, it's difficult to come to any conclusion other than those who are in a position to fix things appear to be reluctant to do so, and that, I suspect, is the heart of the matter. Thank you so much, Joanne. Let's throw it open and see if anybody else would like to say something at this stage. Please just wave at me if you do. Mr. Paul Pascoe. Paul, please introduce yourself after having taken yourself off mute, and share with us, Paul, what you would like to say on this topic of whistleblowing and Paul Moore. Who are you? What's your background? What's your experience? Please do share, Paul. Thank you very much. You'll need to take yourself off mute first, though, Paul. Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry, just briefly, I wasn't going to say anything, but I've been prompted to by what Joanne said, and the sort of understandable sense that, and what the speaker before her said, the understandable sense that Paul was on his own. I mean, social media was far less advanced when he went through his biggest challenge. And so finding information, sharing information was difficult. And I just wanted to share something, just that it might, in one sense, it might reinforce the extent of the challenge we have, but it might also indicate how we must double or triple the energies to do so. And my interest is, I was defrauded as part of the HBOS Reading fraud between 2003 and 2006. But of course, I didn't know it was a fraud until, thanks to the efforts of people like Anthony Stansfeld and Nikki and Paul Turner, that the crooked banker, or some of the crooked bankers, and some of the external people went to jail for almost 50 years. And when I read about that, I had some pieces of the puzzle that enabled me to go back and realize what had happened. And as a result of that, I've learned a lot about what the banks do. And because of my background and experience, I feel that I'm able to find angles and find initiatives and help people less fortunate than myself in trying to very slowly turn this tide and inject some element of law and order and decency and accountability into the banking sector. The things I wanted, the thing I wanted to mention, which might make everyone put their head in their hands, or else it just reinforces why we need to be smarter, more coordinated, and more coherent, is if you take, and I'll talk about what I know. So it's linked to the HBOS Reading fraud, but two things I think are a perfect example of how the assistance of the lawyers is so crucial to keeping things hidden. And Herbert Smith Freehills have already had one dishonorable mention tonight, so I'm very happy to give them another. You know, they tried to shut the Financial Times up on Wirecard. They were very active in relation to suppressing the post office fraud. We know that they've been very active in trying to suppress true accountability in relation to the HBOS Reading fraud. But two things I want to connect. The first is Sally Masterton's report, which was mentioned by Anthony Stansfeld, but for those who are less familiar with the HBOS Reading fraud, she was sort of the first or the most high profile whistleblower about that. And she wrote a report in 2013-14 that was never completed. It was only ever in draft form. And it basically set out what the fraud was, an awful lot of information that following the criminal trial is just so spot on. And what I think is very interesting thing about that report is that it says that at the time of the existential fundraising, when Lloyds was buying HBOS, which it had dreamed of doing, but never thought it would be allowed to do, in September, October of 2008, it issued a prospectus, initially a circular and then a full prospectus, to raise the funds to enable the acquisition to go ahead and recapitalize the combined bank. And Sally Masterton made very, very clear in her report, which was she was senior in the compliance department of Lloyds Bank. She made very clear that had it been disclosed at that time, what was already clearly known to Lloyds Bank and HBOS Bank in the prospectus about the HBOS Reading fraud, in her opinion, as an experienced compliance officer, the fundraising and the acquisition would not have proceeded and HBOS would have gone bust, and Lloyds shareholders would have been saved from having their safe business undermined. And so I think that's very interesting. But what makes it particularly interesting is when you then take that piece of information, which is looked at by people interested in the HBOS Reading fraud, and you consider another piece of information, which is only looked at by people who are interested in the Lloyds Shareholders Action Group, which was a very substantial piece of litigation brought by hundreds of small Lloyds shareholders who had invested in Lloyds as a very safe, high dividend paying bank. Obviously, they would have been impacted by the financial crash, but the performance of their investment was very adversely affected by the acquisition of HBOS. And in that trial, which concluded before the Sally Masterton Project Lord Turnbull report, as it's known, became publicly known about, the claim for losses from those shareholders was on the basis that information that the shareholders should have had was not disclosed. Now, because the people framing the claim did not know about Sally Masterton's report, they didn't talk about the HBOS Reading fraud because they didn't know about it. What they talked about was what they had discovered, which was some £20 billion of Bank of England emergency funding, which HBOS had, and which it thought it didn't need to disclose. So you're raising funds from shareholders, and you don't say to them that we are so desperate for funding, for liquidity, that we have borrowed £20 billion from the Bank of England. And That wasn't disclosed. So the key part of, one of the key parts of the action was that should have been disclosed, and it wasn't. And what is not been widely reported, or it's been reported, but it's lost in the shuffle of the headline that the bank won that case, they defeated the shareholders, is that the judge decided that that was information that should legally have been disclosed. So then you think, how could the, I don't know how many brokers, nomads, advisors, accountants, auditors, corporate lawyers, other advisors, bankers were in the room looking at this deal, but my guess is it was somewhere between 50 and 100. It is inconceivable to me that not a single person in that room ever said, really sorry, what about this 20 billion elephant in the city, not just the room? What are we going to do about that? This must have been discussed, and it must have been not disclosed. Now, bearing in mind that the court has said that under stock exchange rules, banking rules, every rule and regulation there is, this should have been disclosed. How did some of the brightest and best paid bankers, lawyers, accountants, etc., in Europe all get to that wrong conclusion? It's inconceivable that they could honestly have done that. But that's what they did. And the judge, because of that legal action, the judge only had to decide, did they or didn't they? But the judge decided, and it took some 14 months for his judgment to be handed down. When he handed that judgment down, the FCA's done nothing. No one has done nothing. No one has done anything. No one has said, I've asked the FCA as recently as last month, are you investigating this? We can't tell you. We can't tell you anything that isn't on our website. But you're in control of your website. So why don't you put up on your website whether you're investigating something that is a statement of fact by a judge that is out in the public domain, whether you think it is worthy of investigating. It's not on the website, we can't comment. But the real thing I want to draw is between those two different things. Sally Masterton's report saying, if only the HBOS Reading fraud had been mentioned, that fundraising would not have gone ahead, HBOS would have gone bust, Lloyd shareholders would have been fine. And completely separately, the 20 billion or so, I may have the figure slightly wrong, in which case forgive me, the 20 billion or so of emergency liquidity that the Bank of England was making available to HBOS, which clearly sent a huge signal as to how is it funding its business. And you do have to remember that at this very time, literally 36 hours earlier, HBOS and the FCA had issued a statement, it's still up there on Google, had issued a statement, both of them combined, saying, quotes, HBOS is continuing to fund very satisfactorily, unquote.
Oh my God.
They all knew that was untrue. So FCA, or FSA, as I think it might have been then, was putting its neck on the block, presumably because it knew we'll get the deal across the line with Lloyds. Once that gets across, this all gets repaid. No one ever need know. So they have a reason not to open this up. But the Lloyds, and sorry to take so long, the Lloyds Share Action Group failed in their action because the judge said, even though these debts, this emergency liquidity should have been disclosed, it was not possible for the claimants to prove on a balance of probabilities that if it had been disclosed, that the fundraising still wouldn't have been successful and gone ahead, and therefore their position would still have been the same. They still would have lost out. And the connecting dot, which no one seems to have observed or written about or commented on, is if Sally Masterton's report was visible to the judge, the obvious point would have been, but it wasn't just the 20 billion of emergency liquidity that wasn't disclosed, it was also the fraud. And here we have a Lloyd's compliance officer that says that with one of those, let alone both, this wouldn't have gone away. And the lawyers acting for Lloyd's Bank, who I think were Herbert Smith, did not disclose Sally Masterton's report in the discovery stage of the litigation by the shareholders. So the judge never had it. So
thank you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry to be so passionate about that, but I think those 400 or 500 people have been very badly served.
I think you're right, Paul, and thank you so much. Much of what you've just explained, I was completely unaware of. In fact, I'll put my email address into the chat later, Paul. Please do fix up some telephone time with me, because we've got to try to do something about what you just said. I'm aware that William has would like to follow up on what you've said. He's obviously found it very interesting himself. William, please do take yourself off mute, introduce yourself and share with us your thought. Thank you, William.
I was just going to follow up immediately on what Paul said.
Yeah.
And in relation to the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC, where Sir Win Bischoff went from being chairman of Lloyd's to being chairman of the FRC, I think around 2012, 2014, that sort of era. You may, those familiar with the story will remember that the FRC refused for a decade to investigate KPMG's 2007 audit of HBOS. They refused for a decade. Eventually, they succumbed to pressure from MPs. I think they then thought about it or discussed it for, off the top of my head, for 2 or 3 years. They ignored another whistleblower's evidence. I'm not quite sure which whistleblower that was. And then just prior to the trial, which Paul has referred to, which I think was 2016, 2017 probably, 2 months before the trial, the FRC gave KPMG a clean bill of health in respect of its audit of HBOS. The trial took place. It was a complete fix, the whole thing. And then I think after a period, having given KPMG a clean bill of health over the audit of HBOS, within 9 months of doing so, it issued a public statement criticizing KPMG's audit quality. So it did a 360-degree U-turn on its decision. I'm just going to add to Paul and produce that sort of perspective from the FRC. The whole thing's a complete fix.
William, thank you very much. Robert Delner very correctly made the point, and obviously Paul Moore did as well by way of the video interview we watched, made a point about the importance of the audit function. You know, audits are there to help make sure that what's being reported is true and accurate and fair and reasonable. And I think it's fair to say that the audit profession in the UK, perhaps elsewhere too, has got itself into a bit of a crisis situation, so much so that the Financial Reporting Council is having to be closed down and replaced with another entity called ARGA, A-R-G-A. And as some of you may know, the individual that was appointed to be the first chief executive of ARGA has actually resigned before even the organisation launches. So there continues to be big question marks over the governance framework via the audit function. These are real worries. In a moment, I'm going to invite Kim Schweitzer to talk about the survey idea that we've been discussing. So Kim, just prepare yourself to spend a minute or two just giving a high-level overview, if you don't mind, of the survey idea. And just before Kim does that, I'm going to remind everybody about the Paul Moore Trophy idea. The idea is that somebody who has had the courage to speak out gets recognized for the service they have provided. I'm going to read out the quotation that was inscribed in Latin on Paul's whistle that he was given. It is sweet and honorable to speak up for your country, and quite frankly, anybody that is speaking up about malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling in the financial services sector really is speaking up on behalf of our country. The UK is a wonderful country. It has the potential to re-establish itself as a highly credible financial centre in the world. I say to re-establish itself because there is increasing concern about the level of things like anti-money laundering on a global international scale. There's a question mark over the integrity of the City of London. We don't want that. You know, the country's not great at many things, and we are potentially brilliant at financial services. We all want a clean, trustworthy, honourable, high integrity, high truthfulness, high trustworthiness financial services sector. And that ain't going to happen if we treat whistleblowers badly. These people are heroes in my eyes, and we must salute the courage they have in stepping forward. Kim, I invite you please to share with everybody over a minute or two the ideas we've been discussing about a survey. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you.
So I'll be very brief. Based on Joanne Russo's discussions that we've had in previous meetings, and her knowledge that the CFA had promised to put out a survey to whistleblowers a couple of years ago, and they have not yet done that. What we wanted to do is we wanted to put out a survey by TTF to whistleblowers, which potentially will give 3 benefits, as Andy and a group of us talked about last night, which was to capture good data from whistleblowers, to potentially embarrass the FCA to actually put out the survey, and, you know, giving promises and then not delivering on them in a nice way, but also it would give us a good reason to reach out to whistleblowers and try to provide some support. And what we'd like to do as a recommendation from Mark Bishop is go back to the FCA first and just ask about whether or not they are intending to do this as promised. And if not, then make the recommendation to them that, you know, we're happy to help and would they like to be involved. And so this way we can get more information and allow more whistleblowers to come forward and give us their experiences. And as Joanne, you know, told the group tonight, her experience has not been good. As we know, you know, from Paul's book, his experience has been tragic as well. And, you know, we want to try to step in and try to make a difference here.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a perfect explanation. It really was. I'm just about to put into the chat a message or a question. Please reply yes if you would like to be included in the TTF project group that will be working together to develop the whistleblower trophy idea and/or the whistleblower survey idea, where we invite whistleblowers to anonymously or otherwise, if they prefer, to provide feedback on how they've been treated by the FCA once they had blown the whistle. So we have a yes immediately from Liz Watson. If others would like to be involved in that project, please do step forward. We'll probably end up with a group of about 4, 5, 6 folk, and it's going to be an important piece of work. In a moment, if Larry's available, if Larry would like to speak, Larry's based in Canada. It would be interesting to see across the other side of the Atlantic perspective on topics such as whistleblowing. So Larry, if you're tuned in and willing and able to speak, please prepare to say a comment or two. Mr. Bob Compton, thanks. We'll go to Larry shortly. Bob, I'm going to draw you into this conversation. I know you to be a very, very sound pensions technician, expert. You're very, very strong and good on the topic of governance generally. Bob, is there anything you'd like to say from the perspective of governance? You know, how is it that organizations seem able to fail miserably when people give them information they ought to be taking very seriously? Any comments you'd like to make, Bob, about governance, which I know to be a particular strength of yours? Thank you.
Okay, it's very, very difficult to comment on this because it comes down to the people involved. If people want to cover stuff up, the best governance in the world will fall short. So you've got to have independence. And if the people who are independent are paid either directly or indirectly by the people who want to cover things up, it gets very, very difficult. And that's seen time and time and time again. To have fail-safe governance, you've got to have independence, and people have got to be, like whistleblowers have got to feel free to be bulletproof. And I haven't read all of Paul's book, but I've read the first part. And one thing that came across was he told Crosby when he was being fired, you can't do that. And Crosby couldn't do it, but he still did it. So if people want to do bad things, I break the law, they're going to break the law. They're you know, they're bandits or whatever. So you can't actually change bad behavior. This comes back to stuff, Andy, we've been working on the leadership side, that leadership is, you know, from the top. If the leadership is good, the culture will be better and be good. If the leadership is bad at the top, you've got problems. And people tend to move from one location to another in the city, and it's a bit of a club, and they've all got the vested interest to keep it going. That's the end of my comments.
Bob, really good comments, extremely timely for reasons I'm about to explain. You talk about the importance of culture and culture at the top, and that leadership determines the culture of an organization, all of which we all absolutely embrace. Just today, myself and Debbie Henderson interviewed, sorry, I'll rephrase that. I facilitated and Debbie Henderson interviewed the chief executive of a US bank. This gentleman, a lovely guy, the video is going to be out on TTF TV shortly. Lovely, really lovely gentleman, really lovely gentleman. His job title, he's not the chief executive officer, he's the chief culture officer. He is taking responsibility for the culture in his organization. That's what we want. That's the kind of progressive thinking here. So if we think about these issues in terms of a spectrum, at one end of the scale, we've got people like Darren Williams of Southern Bancorp, who's the chief executive brackets chief cultural officer. Wonderful, you know, full of enlightened thinking, progressive, high integrity, high values. At the other end of the scale, we've got the sorts of things we've been hearing about tonight. There really is a terrible variance in terms of integrity around these issues. And TTF exists to try to make a difference in relation to that. Mr. Larry Elford, lovely to see you with us again. Larry, please introduce yourself briefly and share your thoughts about whether there have been any kind of parallels to the sorts of things we've been talking tonight about in the UK, in your country, Canada. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everybody. I'm Larry Elford. I live in Western Canada in Alberta, and I worked 20 years inside the financial industry as an investment broker with some of the largest banks in Canada. And I found that there's two very important codes working in that industry or with any of the organizations I've worked with. The one code that is put forth for everyone's view is called the Code of Ethics, and they are so well written that I couldn't possibly attain that level of ethical writing and flourish if I were to imagine it. And the only problem with that is that the Code of Ethics is what we put up for the public to view, and it's not necessarily what we follow. And I can say that with some experience after 2 decades. The code that we follow when push comes to shove, not all the time, but the code that we follow rigorously and religiously is called the Code of Silence. And the Code of Silence says, do nothing to embarrass the firm, do nothing to embarrass your superiors, do nothing to bring ill repute or any bad reputation upon this corporation. And that code is adhered to. It's not written. It's not even spoken of. It's only through someone like a whistleblower or a former employee or someone who's been through the ranks and been through the ringers, I guess, who can say that there is indeed a code of silence. And if a person, I experienced it myself, if a person makes a reference to the Code of Ethics, they are politely dealt with in manners, in ways that well, I guess they're beaten without leaving any marks, is how one lawyer said it to me. The industry, the corporation will beat you without leaving any marks. And when that was said to me, I laughed and I thanked the lawyer who said that, who was a former chairperson of the Ontario Securities Commission who told me that. And I was young and naive, and I thought, no, that's not the way the world works. And now it's 20 some years later, and I can say that's exactly how the world works. The code of silence rules over the code of ethics. And I won't go into all the details, but what it tells me is that wolves don't follow rules. And there are certain people who, you know, I'm not going to say they're wolves, but there are people who have the ability to be a little bit more desperate, a little bit more sociopathic in their pursuit of whatever. And I could certainly be guilty of that at some points in my life. So I understand it, the pursuit of power and money. But the people who worship that path for their entire lives, they do not follow the rules. We see the example of that now in the United States with some of the political gong show that's going on. The people at the very top do not think the rules apply to them. So long story short, going to a regulator or a corporation or the government to ask them politely if they're going to do something is kind of like going to wolves and asking them if they would kindly not eat sheep anymore. Or it's going to the organization that is hired by the wolves to say, well, we'd like you to consider, or would you consider improving your policies about eating sheep? And I find that that's all kind of meaningless and useless. And so I've sort of said my piece there. I'm still trying to understand it. I've only got 20 years experience in the industry and another 20 years trying to decipher how the industry works and what the solutions are. And I do not have them, but I'm working kind of continuously trying to understand it better, convey what I see, and hear back from 20, 30, 40 people, thanks to Andy's wonderful use of technology. And between all of us, I think the world will come around to some kind of solution through pain and through suffering. And I mentioned on a call the other day, kind of like the Me Too movement came around to solve another kind of abuse that was a pandemic for 100 years, but I watched it disappear in about 30 days, or I watched it become a global, not a solution, but a global awareness in about 30 days a few years ago. And it was simply a matter of the world waking up and changing. And I continue to have hope for that kind of awakening and awareness, thanks to this kind of organization. And I'll stop talking there. And thank you, Andy. I appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Larry. We appreciate your comments. Larry's recently written a very, very, very good book, which is all about these sorts of issues. And I'm very pleased to say that Larry's going to be the subject of one of our upcoming book review sessions in the not too distant future. So look out for that. You should all be getting the Transparency Times each week. If you don't, then please let me know. I'm very pleased to say we have with us this evening John Howard, who's the chair of the Transparency Task Force Advisory Group. John, like Bob Compton, is somebody I admire very much in the context of governance. And it might be that John has something to say. If he does, please refer to that when I invite you to do so in a couple of minutes, John. Before we do that, I'll just check in with everybody else. There's been some great comments in the chat, for which I'm very, very grateful. In a few moments after John Howard's spoken, we'll go to Robert Delner to invite Robert Delner to finish the session for us with any final comments he would like to make. But can I invite anybody else at this stage just to wave your hand if there is something you'd like to say? We go from one Canadian to another, Mr. Ed de Toohig, all the way over from Nova Scotia. And for those that don't know Ed, Ed's got a tremendous background in, well, in all sorts of things. Ed, please take yourself off mute and share with us what you would like to say. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Andy. Just as a sideline, I'm very concerned all the time about the denigration of the social media by politicians and bureaucrats and the other commercial media. And I was interested in listening to the stories on this program about what was said in the public media and also in the social media? And was there any interactions between the two? Because I can imagine that if anything appeared in the social media, that it would be even quickly picked up by the other media or the politicians or the bureaucrats or whatever, and denigrated at that point. So just that connection, and if it ever comes up, I'd like to hear what the relationship may have been. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you very much, Ed. Before we go to John Howard, I'm going to invite Alex Varley-Winter to comment on that particular point. For those of you that don't know, Alex Varley-Winter, on a purely voluntary basis, is putting a significant amount of time and effort into TTF by being our head of investigative reporting and media relations. And I would just like Alex to comment on her perception, based upon the discussions we've had within TTF Symposia, about the ability of the big banks and institutions to sometimes influence or even censor what the media comes up with. Obviously, Alex, speak very generally here. We don't want to get ourselves into any trouble, but please speak freely about your understanding of the ability of large organizations to have some influence over the media. Thank you, Alex.
Well, my perspective is that basically over the past 20 years, since the noughties, the internet has kind of taken the bottom out of the journalism industry, in the sense that it's much more difficult to make advertising revenue. It's much more difficult to make newspapers viable. So you get a sort of race to the bottom on sensation. So you get a lot of clickbait type stories, a lot of just trying to churn social media to get more engagement and that kind of thing. At the same time, you get a sort of depletion of resources that people can channel into legal battles. And so I feel like the solution to sort of equalizing the media, I mean, making it a force, a democratic force that is really strong and powerful, is partly to do with how the legal system works in around the world, really, in the sense of equality of arms, access to justice, having good lawyers on both sides is very important. If a big institution is going to basically try and break the rules and cover up and try and use their weight to do that, because it comes down to resources. So often good editors might shy away from a fight because they don't want to take on an institution of that size that dwarfs their own. But if the evidence is good enough, then you can, but it's just, you're lucky if you get it.
Thank you very much, Alex. Lovely. We're going to go to John Howard, then we're going to go to Robert Delner to bring the session to a close. After Robert speaks, I'll just say a few final words myself. John, great for you to be with us tonight. By the way, John, feel free to mention your book as well, because like Larry, your book's going to be featured in one of these sessions in a few weeks' time. John, introduce yourself and tell us about your book and share with us your thoughts about governance in the financial sector. Thank you, John.
Yes, you inveigled me into doing it, Andy, in your typical way. Thank you very much indeed. And just as a response to that about social media, the other side of the coin is that, of course, this sort of programming is now part of social media. You wouldn't see this necessarily on the TV or hear it on the radio, but what a great forum this has been, with some fantastic contributions. I originally trained as a lawyer and then joined the BBC. I was 20 years with the BBC presenting programs, and I've somewhat regretted the downward trend in journalistic standards because of the event of social media, but it does have a second side, and I think we ought to be encouraging that. And I think this is great, Andy. All credit to you for setting this up and getting it going. I was after I stopped being part of the media, I found myself going into financial services in a rather unexpected way. It was not part of a career choice. I ended up chairing the Financial Services Consumer Panel, which was part of the Financial Services Authority. And this was at the time of HBOS and James Crosby being there. And one of the points that hasn't been mentioned, of course, that James Crosby, as well as being chief executive of HBOS, was also on the board of the Financial Services Authority. That struck me as being extraordinarily odd when the various controversies came up, but another point to throw in. I think I've got the answer.
Go for it, John, go for it.
I'll say that. But of course, I'm not going to give it to you when I discuss my book, because it's all in my book. I might be overclaiming, but I experienced a number of various market scandals in the last few years. I went from financial services and went through the banking crash. I chaired the Financial Services Consumer Panel at the time. The banking crash, I saw what happened there. I went through what was one of the biggest scandals in banking in this country. It doesn't apply in other parts of the world. That was the payment protection insurance scandal, where millions of people were defrauded by the banks, and exactly what happened there. I then went and joined the board of the energy regulator, Ofgem, where they were having similar problems. So the book looks at what are the common currencies in all of these problems. And I think it comes down to this, that Darwin was a better economist than Adam Smith. He probably didn't realize it at the time, but I think if you look at what Darwin said about the evolution of the species can also apply to marketplaces. And my book's subtitle is The Evolution of Fairness. And I think that's what it's all about. So the other issue I just bring in is that if you're going to have any handle on trying to control what any of these sectors do, is that there's got to be some independent input. And we talked about the failure of auditors. And I think until someone recognizes that you can't have the bank that is being audited paying the auditors for that service, you won't get anything done about it. What's got to happen, I think, is that the bank has to employ an auditor that is decided upon by the regulator, and the regulator also has sight over the fees. When you think of some of the things that have happened in the auditing sector, and that you find that some of the partners involved in that auditing are earning £1 million a year, you do wonder whether it's really a service that is working out as effective for society. So that's the thing I'd say about auditors. So my book, Darwin and the Naked Market, The Evolution of Fairness, and I'd be very happy to explain to you how I think it solves some of these problems.
Bravo, bravo, John. Thank you so much. It's, well, from my point of view, it's been a wonderful session, and we really do have Robert Dellner to thank for that. Robert, can I go to you, please, for any final comments that you'd like to make before I finally wrap up the session? Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Andy, very much. And it was good to hear you, John, as well. And I think, unless I'm taking it out of your book, I believe Darwin, of course, said the survival of the fittest, but didn't he also say that it's also the species that has the highest capacity to change which survives, or something of that ilk? So essentially, I think that kind of summarizes also where we are at and where we need to go, that it's the capacity to change which is the function of survival as well. But from my perspective, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and also in honor of Paul for your participation and interest. And it just leaves me really to say thank you, and obviously also in honor of Paul and the book, and in respect for the legacy that he has left behind for us to work with, that this is not this is not the end. This is the beginning, of something which together we can take forward. So I'll leave it to Andy for any final words and comments.
Thank you very much. Before I do anything else, can we please once again thank Robert for his session today? It's been absolutely first class in my opinion. I hope you agree. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very, very much indeed. Good man. Good man. And depending on your views, there may be somebody else up there somewhere washing down with a smile on his face today. Who knows? Who knows? Okay. The Transparency Task Force is about making change happen. I love the point that Robert just made. The capacity to change is a key success factor in the evolution of species. Will the financial services sector change? That's the big question. Will it allow itself to become more serving of society rather than exploited by the relatively few with a great deal of power and influence? Can we as a society get ourselves to a point where we truly cherish the value of people who've got the special guts, the special courage to stand up and speak out, sometimes under tremendous personal pressure, who go on to pay a huge price? I've had all sorts of conversations with whistleblowers over the last few years, and believe you me, some of them have experienced unimaginable types of pain as a consequence, pain and anguish as a consequence of how they've been made to feel. They haven't done anything wrong at all, but they are made to feel that way. This is something that must change. So we are determined to make a difference. The Transparency Task Force is all about making a difference. We're not just a talking shop. Believe you me, if we just spoke about stuff and we didn't make a difference, I'd wrap things up tomorrow morning and I'd go and triple my income doing what I used to do. The only reason doing this makes sense is my absolute belief that we can make a difference. And for that, we have a strategy for driving change, which is about bringing together the thinking of two groups of people. On one hand, there are those like us on this session and the 2,700 in our community who have a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. And the other group are those that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible. The policymakers, the regulators, the politicians. These are the people with the hands on the steering wheel. They are the people in charge. We have to find ways to influence what they do and how they do it in the interest of society. And believe you me, if we and organizations like us don't speak up on behalf of the consumer will continue to be terribly poorly represented, because we have a terrible mismatch, an asymmetry of power and an asymmetry of information. So if, like us, you feel that there is a mission here that is worthwhile, please do step up and volunteer to get actively involved. We genuinely believe that our cause is both noble and necessary. And from today's session, there are a few very simple actions. Number one, please ask yourself, do you have some time to help us in relation to the project about the whistleblower trophy and or the research project? If you haven't already put a yes in the chat relating to that, then please do now, or phone me tomorrow or email me tomorrow. Please do connect. Another thing you can do is help spread the word. We do not have any marketing budget whatsoever. We don't have money to spend on anything. You probably know people who are on our kind of wavelength. And if you do, please tell them about TTF and encourage them to get involved if they wish to. That's pretty much the final thing that I wanted to say, other than to very simply thank you all once again for participating tonight. Kim, thanks to you for developing the survey idea. It's wonderful. Robert, thank you to yourself. Thanks to Larry and Ed over in Canada, everybody else in the UK. Paul Pascoe for some seriously powerful insight. Joanne for speaking straight from the heart. Joanne, never apologize for being emotional. It's because you are emotional that your voice is so credible. It is wonderful to hear you even now, despite what you've been through, Joanne, having the guts and the courage to continue to speak out. Thank you all very much. I wish you a good afternoon, evening, whatever it is where you are. Thank you all very much indeed. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you. Very good. Very, very good. Thank you. Bravo.